In Jesus' day, on the 14th of the Jewish month of Nisan, the male representative of a household would bring a memorial lamb to the Jerusalem temple. After presenting it to one of the thousands of priests on duty at Passover, the worshipper then killed the animal to be eaten later, while the priest caught the blood in a sacred bowl. The bowl was then passed back along a line of priests and the blood tossed against the base of the temple altar. The Passover lamb was far more than a memorial. It was a sacrifice. Its blood was poured out before the Lord. As families later gathered in their homes to eat the lamb, they were reminded that God's mercy was theirs because his judgment had passed over. Understanding this clarifies Jesus' strange words at the Last Supper. Jesus often warned of God's judgment on those who refused the path of love, but by describing his coming death as the new covenant in his blood poured out for many, he was apparently suggesting that his self-sacrifice would save people from judgment. It was as if he was the Passover lamb. The idea that God requires a blood sacrifice is a disturbing one for many today, but it wasn't for an ancient Jew like Jesus. Just as a judge wouldn't release a criminal simply because he felt positively inclined toward him, so the God of Israel wouldn't simply forgive the guilty without at the same time fulfilling his justice. Love it or hate it, that was the Jewish point of view. And Jesus literally embodied the thought. His death would satisfy God's justice and so secure his mercy. So Greg, here we are at the famous Stations of the Cross, the Via Dolorosa. This is Station 6, meant to be the path that Jesus took to his crucifixion. But that whole thing raises the question I've been asked many times before, why the need for blood for forgiveness? Why couldn't God just magnanimously forgive people?
It's a fair question, isn't it? But the real problem is justice. For justice to be done, a price has to be paid. I mean, we would be outraged if someone, a criminal who's done terrible acts, just got away with it. Some price has to be paid for us to feel that justice has been done.
Sure, but some people would then say, but why someone else? Why did God have to punish his son, a third party, for what we've done?
Yeah, I think it's really wrong to think of God as some sort of cosmic child abuser, which is the phrase that's sometimes used. In Christian theology, the teaching's always been that Jesus is divine, Jesus is God. And so the way the Bible describes this is that God was in Christ reconciling the world to himself. So it's not a third party, it's God dealing with the problem of sin in himself. An image that really helps me with this is the idea of the judge standing in front of the lawbreaker. Instead of condemning him, coming down from his seat and paying the fine himself. Now, Jesus is described as that judge, so he can do it. He has the right to pay the fine. He's the judge of humanity in Christian teaching. And when you look at it that way, I mean, the cross becomes not an image of torture and brutality, but a source of life and love.
There are debates over the details, but overwhelmingly, contemporary scholars accept the Gospel's passion story as historically sound. Jesus was betrayed by one of his band of 12 disciples. He was tried by the Jewish and Roman authorities before being sentenced to death by the Roman governor Pontius Pilate. He was scourged, led outside these city walls, and crucified under the mocking charge, King of the Jews.
When the execution party arrived at the place called the Skull, they crucified Jesus. The people stood by, watching. The leaders even made fun of him, saying, "He rescued others. Let him rescue himself if he really is God's Christ, his chosen one." There was a placard above him that read, "This is the King of the Jews." It was about midday, but darkness came over the whole land until 3 in the afternoon. Then Jesus cried out in a loud voice, "Father, Into your hand I entrust my spirit. With these words, he breathed his last breath.
There were countless crucifixions in the 1st century. Just near here in August AD 70, 500 Jews a day were crucified by the Romans, according to Josephus, until there was no more space for crosses, nor crosses for bodies. So at one level, what happened to Jesus wasn't unique. Many people met a similar fate. But when you consider the meaning Jesus attached to his cross and the impact it's had on countless millions of lives ever since, there is a sense in which his was a most extraordinary death. What for Pilate was a minor administrative matter, soon forgotten, was for the first Christians the centre, the crux of God's mercy for the world.